People change their behavior toward you the moment they sense you need them. This shift occurs automatically, below conscious awareness, driven by psychological mechanisms that operate regardless of their conscious intentions or moral values. The change manifests in subtle ways initially. Response times to messages increase, invitations become less frequent, conversations become more transactional. The person who once sought your company now seems to tolerate it. This transformation puzzles those who believe that needing others should generate sympathy and support rather than distance and diminished respect. The confusion arises from misunderstanding how human psychology processes dependency signals. Need creates asymmetrical power dynamics that fundamentally alter social relationships. When someone becomes aware of your dependence on them, they unconsciously adjust their behavior to reflect this new power balance. This adjustment happens regardless of their conscious beliefs about friendship, loyalty, or human kindness. The psychological shift operates at a deeper level than moral reasoning, activating ancient survival instincts that evaluate social hierarchies based on resource dependencies and mutual value exchange. Watch how this pattern emerges in romantic relationships. The partner who constantly seeks reassurance, requires frequent contact, or displays anxiety about the relationship's stability typically experiences declining romantic interest rather than increased affection. The needy partner believes that expressing their emotional needs should generate understanding and reciprocal care. Instead, their dependency signals trigger subconscious evaluation of their relationship value. The more they need the relationship, the less attractive they become within it. This occurs because dependency suggests limited options and reduced personal value. If someone desperately needs a particular relationship, it implies they cannot easily find alternatives. This limitation makes them a less valuable partner in the unconscious calculus that drives attraction and respect. The independent partner who maintains autonomy, pursues personal interests, and demonstrates comfort with solitude typically commands more attention and romantic investment. Their self-sufficiency signals high value and abundant options, making them more attractive precisely because they seem less attainable. Professional environments demonstrate this dynamic clearly. The employee who constantly seeks approval, requires extensive guidance, or expresses anxiety about job security typically receives less respect and fewer advancement opportunities than colleagues who demonstrate independence and competence. The dependent employee signals that they need the job more than the job needs them. This perception affects how supervisors and colleagues interact with them. They become viewed as a liability rather than an asset, someone who requires support rather than someone who provides value. The self-sufficient employee who demonstrates competence, maintains professional boundaries, and appears comfortable with uncertainty typically receives more opportunities and respectful treatment. Their independence signals that they have options and confidence in their abilities. Friendship dynamics reveal similar patterns. The friend who constantly calls, always needs advice, or regularly requires emotional support often finds themselves gradually excluded from social activities or treated as a burden rather than a valued companion. The needy friend believes that sharing their problems and seeking support should strengthen friendships. Instead, their dependency creates imbalance that makes others uncomfortable. They become associated with emotional labor rather than mutual enjoyment. The friend who maintains emotional stability, offers support to others, and demonstrates independence typically enjoys more invitations, deeper respect, and longer-lasting friendships. Their emotional self-sufficiency allows others to enjoy their company without feeling obligated to provide constant support. Family relationships also reflect these dynamics, though they operate through more complex loyalty systems. The family member who constantly requires financial help, emotional support, or problem-solving assistance typically receives grudging compliance rather than enthusiastic help. Even within family structures where support obligations exist, dependency creates resentment and shifts power dynamics. The self-sufficient family member who rarely asks for help typically receives more respect and voluntary assistance when they occasionally need support. Business relationships demonstrate how dependency affects commercial negotiations and partnerships. The vendor who desperately needs a particular contract typically receives less favorable terms than one who demonstrates financial stability and alternative options. Clients unconsciously respond to desperation signals by reducing their offer or increasing their demands. They sense that the desperate vendor lacks bargaining power and will accept unfavorable terms rather than lose the opportunity. The vendor who appears financially secure and selective about clients typically receives better treatment and more favorable contract terms. Their independence suggests they have alternatives and can walk away from inadequate offers. Social status hierarchies operate through these dependency recognition systems. The person who constantly seeks social validation, requires inclusion in group activities, or displays anxiety about social acceptance typically occupies lower status positions within their social circles. Their need for group approval signals that they lack alternatives and depend on the group for self-worth. This dependence makes them easy to ignore or exclude because they will tolerate poor treatment rather than risk complete social isolation. The socially independent person who maintains diverse relationships, demonstrates comfort with solitude, and shows selective participation in group activities typically enjoys higher status and more respectful treatment. The psychological mechanisms driving these responses evolved in environments where resource scarcity made dependency recognition crucial for survival. Groups needed to identify who contributed value versus who consumed resources without reciprocal benefit. These evaluation systems persist in modern environments where physical survival rarely depends on group membership. People still unconsciously assess others based on dependency signals and adjust their behavior accordingly. The irony becomes clear. The more you need people, the less they value you. The less you need them, the more attention and respect you typically receive. This creates a feedback loop where independence generates social value while dependency erodes it. Dating markets provide visible examples of this dynamic. The person who appears desperate for romantic partnership typically struggles to attract quality partners. Their desperation signals limited options and reduced romantic value. Dating advice often misses this fundamental point by focusing on communication techniques or appearance improvements, while ignoring the underlying dynamic of neediness. The desperate person can learn better conversation skills, but their underlying desperation will still repel potential partners. The person who demonstrates romantic independence, maintains personal interests, and appears comfortable with single life typically attracts more romantic interest. Their autonomy suggests they have options and choose partners rather than accepting anyone who shows interest. Professional networking events demonstrate similar patterns. The person who desperately seeks employment or business opportunities typically receives polite but unhelpful responses. Their desperation makes others uncomfortable and signals that they offer limited value. The professionally secure person who networks strategically and offers mutual value typically builds stronger connections and receives genuine assistance. Their independence allows others to see potential benefits rather than obligation burdens. Lending relationships reveal how dependency affects financial interactions. The person who constantly needs to borrow money typically finds that friends and family become less available over time, regardless of their repayment history. The repeated need for financial help signals poor resource management and creates ongoing obligation dynamics that strain relationships. Even when loans are repaid, the pattern of dependency changes how others perceive their financial competence. The financially independent person who rarely asks for help typically finds that others willingly offer assistance during genuine emergencies. Their established independence makes occasional requests seem legitimate rather than part of an ongoing pattern. Emotional support dynamics operate through similar mechanisms. The person who constantly needs emotional validation, requires frequent reassurance, or regularly discusses personal problems typically exhausts their support network over time. Their emotional neediness creates asymmetrical relationships where others provide consistent support without reciprocal benefit. This imbalance generates resentment and avoidance behaviors, even among naturally supportive individuals. The emotionally stable person who provides support to others while managing their own challenges independently typically enjoys stronger relationships and more available help during genuine crises. Crisis situations reveal how dependency patterns affect emergency support. The person with a history of creating or magnifying personal crises typically receives less enthusiastic help than someone who rarely needs assistance. Their crisis pattern signals poor life management and creates expectation that help will be needed repeatedly. Others begin to withdraw support to avoid being drawn into ongoing problems. The self-reliant person who faces genuine unexpected difficulties typically receives immediate and generous assistance. Their established independence makes the crisis appear legitimate and temporary rather than part of an ongoing pattern. Mentoring relationships demonstrate how neediness affects learning opportunities. Students or junior professionals who constantly seek guidance, require extensive hand-holding, or display anxiety about making mistakes typically receive less investment from potential mentors. Their excessive neediness signals that mentoring them will require significant energy without corresponding benefits. Mentors prefer working with individuals who demonstrate independence and use guidance efficiently. The self-directed learner who asks strategic questions, implements advice effectively, and demonstrates progressive improvement typically attracts multiple mentors willing to invest significant time and expertise. Social media environments amplify these dynamics by making dependency signals more visible. The person who constantly posts about their problems, seeks validation through comments, or displays emotional instability typically receives declining engagement over time. Their digital neediness creates fatigue among their network, who begin to scroll past their content rather than engaging with ongoing drama or validation requests. The algorithm also reduces visibility for content that generates low engagement. The person who shares valuable content, demonstrates interesting life experiences, and maintains positive presence typically builds engaged followings and receives meaningful social media interactions. Parenting contexts show how dependency affects parent-child relationships. Children who develop excessive dependence on parental support typically struggle more with independence development and receive more anxious parental attention. The anxiety creates negative feedback loops where increased parental involvement generates more child dependence, which triggers more parental concern about the child's capability. Children who demonstrate age-appropriate independence and problem-solving abilities typically receive more respectful treatment and greater freedom from parents who trust their judgment. Therapeutic relationships reveal how client neediness affects treatment effectiveness. Clients who become overly dependent on their therapist, contact them frequently outside sessions, or resist developing independent coping strategies typically make slower progress. Their dependency interferes with the therapeutic goal of building personal resilience and self-management capabilities. Therapists must spend energy managing the dependency rather than focusing on skill development. Clients who engage actively in therapy while maintaining appropriate boundaries and working toward independence typically achieve better outcomes and more collaborative therapeutic relationships. Understanding why neediness changes how people treat you requires recognizing that humans unconsciously evaluate relationships based on reciprocal value exchange. When someone appears to need the relationship more than they contribute to it, others naturally reduce their investment. This evaluation system operates automatically and affects behavior regardless of conscious intentions about fairness or loyalty. People typically do not deliberately punish neediness, but they unconsciously adjust their behavior to reflect perceived relationship value. The strategic approach involves building genuine independence that reduces actual neediness rather than simply hiding dependency while maintaining it. Surface-level attempts to appear independent while remaining emotionally or practically dependent typically fail because the underlying neediness eventually becomes apparent. Authentic independence requires developing personal resources, maintaining diverse relationships, and building comfort with solitude. This creates genuine options that naturally reduce dependency on any particular person or relationship. The individual who achieves real independence typically finds that others seek their company more actively because the relationship feels voluntary rather than obligatory. Their autonomy creates space for genuine connection based on mutual value rather than one-sided support. This understanding changes how one approaches relationship building and maintenance. Instead of trying to get needs met through others, the focus shifts to developing personal capabilities that reduce neediness while increasing value contribution to relationships. The result typically involves stronger, more satisfying relationships built on mutual respect rather than dependency dynamics. The paradox resolves. By needing people less, you often receive more of their genuine attention and care. The observer, who grasps why neediness repels rather than attracts, can position themselves more strategically in all relationship contexts. They can build authentic independence that generates respect rather than dependency that creates obligation burdens. Most importantly, they can recognize that the goal is not isolation or complete self-reliance, but rather balanced relationships where mutual value exchange creates sustainable connection rather than exhausting dependency dynamics. Academic environments demonstrate how intellectual dependency affects educational relationships. Students who constantly require professor approval typically receive less academic mentoring and fewer research opportunities. Corporate ladder dynamics reveal how career neediness affects professional advancement. Employees who constantly seek promotion validation typically progress more slowly than confident colleagues. Investment relationships show how financial neediness affects business partnerships. Entrepreneurs who demonstrate desperate need for capital typically receive less favorable investment terms. Healthcare relationships reveal how patient neediness affects medical care quality. Patients who constantly seek reassurance typically receive more rushed consultations and less personalized care. Legal relationships demonstrate how client neediness affects attorney-client dynamics. Clients who constantly seek legal validation typically receive less strategic attention from their attorneys. Dating market economics illustrate how romantic neediness affects partner selection. Individuals who demonstrate desperate search behaviors typically attract partners who exploit their desperation. Professional service relationships reveal how client neediness affects service quality. Clients who constantly seek provider reassurance typically receive less efficient service and may face higher prices. Crisis intervention dynamics demonstrate how emergency neediness affects community support. Individuals who frequently experience personal crises typically receive declining community assistance over time. Educational mentorship reveals how learning neediness affects knowledge transfer. Students who constantly require validation typically receive less invested mentorship from teachers and advisors. Parenting relationships show how child neediness affects family dynamics. Children who develop excessive emotional dependence typically receive more anxious parenting rather than confidence-building support. The pattern emerges consistently. Neediness creates asymmetrical dynamics that reduce respect and value perception. Understanding this mechanism enables strategic approaches to relationship building that generate respect rather than obligation burdens. The effective individual develops authentic independence through personal capability building rather than attempting to hide neediness while maintaining dependency. This creates genuine options that naturally reduce relationship pressure while increasing relationship value. The result typically involves stronger connections built on mutual choice rather than obligation, where others seek their company because the relationship feels voluntary and valuable rather than burdensome and required. This understanding transforms how one approaches relationship challenges by focusing on personal development that reduces neediness rather than strategies that try to get needs met through others while maintaining dependency patterns. The strategic perspective recognizes that the most attractive quality in any relationship context is the ability to be happy alone, which paradoxically makes others more interested in sharing your company rather than feeling obligated to support your emotional or practical needs. Workplace dynamics demonstrate how professional neediness affects career trajectory. Employees who constantly seek manager approval create perception problems that extend beyond their work quality. Social circle maintenance reveals how friendship neediness affects group dynamics. The person who constantly initiates contact often finds themselves gradually marginalized despite their efforts. Financial advisory relationships show how investment neediness affects service quality. Clients who constantly worry about market fluctuations typically receive more basic service approaches rather than sophisticated strategies. Romantic partner introduction dynamics reveal how relationship neediness affects social acceptance. Partners who display obvious dependency often create social awkwardness that leads to couple exclusion from group activities. Business networking situations show how professional neediness affects relationship building. Individuals who approach networking events with obvious desperation typically make fewer valuable contacts because their neediness makes others uncomfortable. Family gathering dynamics reveal how relative neediness affects family standing. Members who constantly seek attention during gatherings often find themselves excluded from important family decisions despite their desire for inclusion. Mentoring relationships demonstrate how learning neediness affects knowledge transfer. Students who constantly require validation typically receive less invested mentorship. Service industry interactions show how customer neediness affects service quality. Clients who constantly seek reassurance typically receive more basic approaches. Online community participation reveals how digital neediness affects virtual relationships. Members who constantly seek validation typically experience declining engagement because their digital neediness creates audience fatigue. Professional development contexts demonstrate how growth neediness affects advancement. Individuals who constantly seek approval for career decisions typically receive less investment from mentors and supervisors. These patterns operate consistently because humans unconsciously evaluate others based on dependency signals. Those who appear to need relationships more than they contribute naturally receive reduced investment from others. The consistent pattern across all relationship contexts demonstrates that neediness fundamentally alters social dynamics by creating asymmetrical value exchange. Understanding this mechanism provides strategic insight for building relationships that generate respect rather than obligation. The most effective approach involves developing genuine independence that reduces actual neediness rather than attempting to hide dependency while maintaining it. This requires building personal resources, emotional stability, and diverse support networks that create real options. The result transforms relationship dynamics from dependency-based to choice-based, where interactions feel voluntary and valuable rather than obligatory and draining. This shift typically produces stronger, more satisfying connections built on mutual respect rather than one-sided support requirements. The observer who understands why needing people changes how they treat you can position themselves strategically across all relationship contexts. They can build authentic independence that attracts others rather than neediness that repels them. This understanding reveals the fundamental paradox. Those who need others least typically receive the most attention and respect. Those who need others most often find themselves ignored or treated as obligations. The strategic individual focuses on building genuine autonomy rather than hiding dependency. This creates authentic independence that naturally generates respect and attraction across relationships. The transformation occurs when neediness shifts from a relationship strategy to a relationship liability. Understanding this mechanism enables effective approaches to building connections that enhance rather than diminish personal status.